So they're going to have a commission into looking at corruption to make sure that New Zealand's reputation as a low corruption country continues. That's at least how NZB reports the story. The first thing that makes me laugh is that, for years New Zealand media will go around going, New Zealand, we're got the lowest corruption. I mean, this is another case of shitty reporting, not actually fact-checking, just repeating something because it makes you feel good. The real reality is what they're talking about is the Transparency International, which is an international watchdog that basically sends out a questionnaire to governments all around the world and asks them to basically fill in this questionnaire and send it back. And then from that, they grade them on corruption. New Zealand has always graded the lowest because we don't fill in the form. We send it back. That's actually a fact. And so this whole idea that we're like, oh, we're corruption-free, this is nonsense. This is the nonsense that you report to yourself when the rest of the fact of the matter is New Zealand internationally, we're known as a bit of a joke, and we're known as a bit of a money laundering pit. We narrowly got put on the blacklist, and this was during the Paradise Papers, which John Key came out saying, oh, no, it's a one-off, New Zealand's not involved, it's an aberration, we're not part of a money laundering tax haven status whatsoever at all. And then the Naked Lunch Capitalism website turned around and said, well, actually, your name mentioned 60,000 times in the Paradise Papers. And as I've also mentioned to you, you've got people like Alan Hubbard from the South Canterbury Finance, the company which was jointly owned by Humphrey Wollaston, who co-founded the Christchurch Press. And Alan Hubbard, that company, I wrote about, I had a whole chapter basically about how this company, right down next door to the police station, effectively one block over, it was full of ex-police officers working with some incredibly dodgy people, gang connections, white-collar embezzlement, Russian mafia. And I literally went through the whole company files that are in the main, when you walk through the door and there's a list there. And I went through, did all the company files, and then this exposed, and then 2 years later, South Canterbury Finance actually collapsed. Now, the thing about those company files was that what I was also saying for my first book, In State Secrets, was the way I panned out and, mapped all these actually out, was that basically what the problem was that you could come and set up a nominee company and then use it to this no company is owned to Peter Blakely Foundation group, and then you look at who owns that, and it would turn out to be owned by the same company. So it just loop round. They'd actually do that more like 12 times, so it's much more complicated than that. But that's pretty much from spending a couple of months in there, I started to get the snapshot. And I wrote my book State Secrets in 1999 when we were told, every single journalist in this country said there was no such thing as organised crime. I even interviewed Pat Booth, who wrote a very good in-depth inquiry on Mr. Asia inquiry. And he said the same thing. His stuff had been looking at 1970s. However, I went and interviewed Keith Petersen, who was from the Justice Department. And from basically it kind of goes, you've got the Gang of 20, which is involved in a lot of people involved in things like the Fiji coup, later involved in early before that, the uprising in Vanuatu and attempted uprising in Tonga, later connected to the uprising use of the Sandide mercenary affair in PNG, which again, all those are mining connected. PNG, the planes that they were using, they were actually based in New Zealand, basically linked to Russian-Israeli, Ukrainian-Israeli guys that were doing all this incredibly dodgy stuff, which Rod Vaughan reported about, connected that to Southern Air Transport, connected that to New Zealand ministers. They also had immigration ministers, consultants that were advising, some Southern World Airways, which became Pacific Express, which is this dodgy bunch of Ukrainian Israelis. We had the Food for Oil program, again, some very, very major companies involved in it, and then Winston Peters turned around saying, "Oh no, we've looked into that, and we're not involved in that at all." Transparency International again turned around and said, "Well, you didn't actually look at the primary documents, so you haven't really conducted an investigation." Winston Peters comes out and says later after that, we've launched a police probe and a Serious Fraud Office investigation. I rang the police department. Their media spokesman said, no, that's actually not happened. Southern Serious Fraud Office, which is the background of Serious Fraud Office, was the original officer that was going to be in charge of the SSFO was Warwick Reid. He got taken away in handcuffs because it turned out that he was part of, he was a large number of the Serious Fraud Office previously worked for the Hong Kong Magistrate Office, and a lot of them were implicated in what they call the Carrian fraud case, and those are the guys that we hired to hunt down corruption in New Zealand. And nothing's really changed. They still have a very culture of basically, the politicians send them after the people that they want to go after, but they don't go looking for proper, actually white-collar crime. And I said from Keith Petersen, who was the guy that sort of exposed a lot of this early stuff from what they called the Gang of 20, central character that was John Warburton, a lawyer. He was basically the police raided him later on during the Winebox inquiry when they knew that Winston Peters had copies and they thought Warburton had. So there's a sort of an inference there that Winston Peters got his material on the Winebox inquiry from John Warburton, and John Warburton and his affiliates were closely affiliated with the Paradise Papers, or the Panama Papers, which then became the Paradise Papers, and it could sort of look like they were actually trying to sink their opposition, which in this case was Faye Richwhite Investigation, whose babysitter, I think Michael Fay's babysitter's father was Charles Sturt, the head of the Serious Fraud Office. So the Winebox inquiry, which effectively was a precursor to what we would find in the same formats and the same patterns, you would find those patterns later on in the Paradise and the Panama Papers, the same money laundering patterns. And again, the generics of this is that if you go to the Las Vegas Museum of Organised Crime, you'll find a map there of the money laundering, of how it kind of goes from out of America into these small Midwest towns and then into New York. Backtrack that map to kind of effectively from Europe, which normally be, and this kind of be in and opposite ends, it can go either way, but normally it'd be through a Pacific island into the European, and normally from something like Central Europe to either United Kingdom and then into the United States, or the other way around, Central to United Kingdom to Central Europe to the Pacific. In that case, there was also the route that would come in through Eastern Europe, where we do the same situation, Eastern Europe to Vanuatu, where you would go to a place like Vanuatu where you'd have Proc Bank, which was the Russian tax haven that I wrote about in my book, State Secrets. There was literally no organised crime until I wrote that book, and then they went off and did a survey and they identified 375 organised crime syndicates. Then they set up an organised crime bureau as a result of State Secrets. That's the timeline chronologically. And of course, one of the people involved in Proc Bank was Ross Meruant. Really should go and have a look at the Food for Oil affair and then look at Ross Meruant's book, the fictional books, The Syrian Connection. Very interesting, very interesting books. But that regardless was the bank, that bank was firing off alerts through Westpac, which was also, we were seeing at the same time, there were money laundering coming through Alex Viknik, who was the cyberbank launderer, for the Russian cyber bankers, and it went from effectively 2003 all the way up to 2017, only after it was discovered that there was a plant inside the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Cameron Ortis, who was actually overseeing a lot of the money laundering investigations covering Australia, New Zealand and the Paradise Papers, that Vitnik occurred. However, what you see is a history there of basically the banks actually doing what they're meant to be doing. Something's not right, they'd send an alert, then nobody at the top would do anything in total. So it's only after the Cameron Ortis affair, which effectively, the outcome of that, according to congressional records, was that they were going to have to set up a new intelligence club because effectively Australia and New Zealand leaked like a sieve at corruption to the highest level. That's the congressional report. Nobody in New Zealand media will mention this. And it actually takes me back to the good old days when Neil Roberts, the head of TVNZ, got busted on the Auckland Harbour Bridge with a kilogram of cocaine. This is in the 1980s. And only magazine to mention that was Rip It Up. So this whole idea that there's no corruption in New Zealand, yeah, good one. Now, as far as this corruption, because these corruption trials are actually happening in PNG at the moment, Australia, in Fiji, all largely because of the result of the Paradise Papers, and they're all running into troubles because it turns out basically the people that they're sending to actually run these investigations are really not doing a very good job or being corrupt themselves. I've actually contacted the Corruption Commission and said, well, I'd like to speak at this, I'd like to give evidence. I get hired by banks in London, they hire me to do money laundering investigations. Or to look at characters and develop profiles basically around them. I've been covering this for 30 years. A lot of my stuff, my track record speaks for me. I did that probably a month ago and I haven't heard one reply back from the Commission actually yet. So there you are. Actually, they're not going to go and get independent experts. They're going to do what they did with the Winebox inquiry, the Gang of 20 affair, Keith Petersen, politicians said, oh, no, that's all been overinflated. They downplayed it. It turned out in the actual fact, after the Waitaki Tourism Development Board and a few other scandals that Keith Petersen, who had also exposed the government corruption on the Air New Zealand case, was doing such a good job that what they did was they shut down the Justice Department's white-collar investigation. They set up the Serious Fraud Office. To date, there's been only 1% of organised crime involves white-collar crime investigations. Not because it isn't there, but because they won't go looking for it. So again, when you look at, for example, Michael Swan in Dunedin, very much affiliated with a lot of the culture in Dunedin, same culture that when they were being told there were dodgy things going on about the Christchurch, about the Dunedin rifle clubs and the Dunedin pistol clubs, they didn't do anything. And some of those pistol clubs had connections to very, very shady security companies that use all the Maltese or the far right. A lot of people from the far right, including ex-Southern Viking road knights, were using those pistol clubs. I wrote about that in probably about 2015. At the same time, I was writing about that the Christchurch, the University of Otago went into lockdown because of 4chan at-chain. Later on, the police said, we didn't investigate that, even though the front page of the newspaper said that's how they found out about it. And they sent in an inquiry to investigate these police officers, which included listing examples of animal abuse and child abuse, which again had all been talked about during the 80s and 90s in Dunedin, but the local newspaper wouldn't report about it, even though the editor himself had been found in the park doing dodgy things and he didn't get arrested. But the local paper wouldn't talk about dodgy police corruption from that point onwards. Was being talked about 4XO, very famous Alan Dick, I want to say Alan Dick, the racing journalist at his own magazine. He was one of the exceptions to the rule. There were cop-outs and cover-ups. Tom Lewis, who's a Dunedin cop, he spoke about it. And again, there was a newspaper article by the Star that talked about these people still being active. Again, these are all things that I was also reporting about at this particular time frame. So afterwards, they also had all these weapons stolen from the pistol club. They sent in the usual suspects to investigate it. These people have been named in a royal inquiry as being, basically the usual serial recidivist carry-outs of corruption, including Alan Gibbs, who worked for ACC, and in the book Cop-Outs and Cover-Ups, which is ghostwritten on behalf of Peter Williams. I think Bruce Ainsley wrote that particular book. He says, no, the police, the ICPA isn't there to protect the public, it's there to whitewash the cops. And they effectively sent Jacinda Ardern, whose father is a senior police officer, who's also involved in doing donations via Niue to companies listed in the Paradise Papers, to National Party. We won't talk about her father being connected to that. That story just went straight to ground. We've never talked about it ever again. But she goes to England and she's working with Sir Ronnie Flanagan, who's the fixer for Tony Blair Institute, very, very dodgy people. And they basically are doing a review coming out of Operation Tiberius, which is effectively 30 years of corruption using the funny handshake brigade. Again, people, same sort of funny handshake brigade you see here in New Zealand with people like David Mace, the head of the funny handshake brigade, also involved in handling out all the money for the Food for Oil programs, which was carried out from Millbrook, where they have all the Five Eyes Society looking for meetings, which is all about how we stop terrorism and money laundering. And yet we find the places where they're having meetings are the people that actually are carrying the stuff actually out. So they had this review in England, and they turned around and decided, what we're going to do is we're going to use the IPCA method for England to stop police corruption, even though we know it doesn't work because of what Peter Williams said in his book Cop-Outs and Cover-Outs. So nobody wants to use so back here in Dunedin, they have an inquiry into these kind of people. I said, this is all on the record. I'm not being defamatory. All I'm doing is, instead of these other stories, reply